Welcome to our webinar today. The title of this webinar, of course, is From Hunting to Automation with Sentinel and Defender, XDR. This is part 1 of 2, so this is a series of webinars where we'll be focusing on this content. Today's focus will be primarily on how to start that hunting process and walk through that hunting process and actually do some hunts. The second part, which will occur later on, next week's currently scheduled, will focus a little bit more on the hunting and then how to potentially automate those hunts within your environment. Again, specifically leveraging Sentinel and Defender. So from an agenda perspective, obviously this is your welcome. We're going to give you sort of like an overview of what we call the attack components. So that's our simplified view of the types of components you need to be looking for when doing an investigation or doing a hunt. We'll quickly review the anatomy of an attack. If you've seen some of our previous webinars on Defender and Sentinel, this will be a little bit of a review, but it's a good just to level set where we are. We'll then go through at a high level the threat hunting process. Just sort of covering off how threat hunting would typically evolve, or what would be involved within an organization when you're going through and building out a threat hunting practice. A little housekeeping note here: the purpose of today's content is certainly not to build out a threat hunting practice, and watching this webinar is not going to turn you into a certified threat hunter. It's much more of a tactical view, really on how you can leverage your existing investment in Defender and Sentinel and some of the components that come with it in order to start that I'll call it more ad hoc hunting process. We'll then give a review or an overview of threat analytics, and then we'll actually start what we're going to refer to as our intel-based hunt or intelligence-based hunt. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover off today. And then, as I said, part 2 will cover off the other components where we will continue that hunt and then work towards automating that hunt. Okay. So let's again do a review of and this is our simplified view of the attack components, things that you need to consider when investigating or hunting. Now, first and foremost, the thing to remember anytime we're dealing with information security is at the end of the day, it is all about the data. There is a little clip there, or quote, if you would, from our 2023 security study. Little pause here just so you know our 2024 security study is about to be released. However, from our 2003 security study, it clearly indicates that while cybersecurity attacks overall year over year are declining, I'm just going to mute that person there. Over year are declining. Data breaches and exfiltration has seen a sharp tick upwards, right? And when we're looking at the data, we have to consider what is it that, what are the attackers' motives? What are the attackers really after? What's their intent, right? Are they looking to steal the data? Are they looking to deny access or tamper with it? Or are they looking at destroying it? So in the context of thinking of a hunt, a lot of that, when you think about the threat intel piece, is understanding what the attackers are really after, right? And that's where when you're looking at the threat intels and the profiles for an attacker, understanding what those motivations are and what their intents are really critical. Our simplified view, and again, if you've attended any of our webinars previously on Defender and Sentinel, you have seen this before, so it is a little bit of a review, but I do think it's important to make note of. We're leveraging, for the purpose of this webinar, kind of a simplified view of what we call the 5 attack components. So when you're investigating and or hunting, these are the things that you want to keep track of as you're going through the investigation or hunting process. The very first thing that you want to make a note of and keep track of is the vector. So how are the attackers actually getting into our environment? And our environment, of course, could be cloud, it could be internal, but what is their mechanism for coming in? Right? Are they coming in through an internet, inbound internet access? Maybe is it through somebody who plugged in a USB that happened to have infected malware? Maybe it's an email phish or credential phish. So making note of those vectors as you're going through your hunt or your investigation, so that you can track those. In particular, because, and it's something I should have mentioned off the top, these components, as we track them, they'll actually serve often in hunting as inputs to subsequent hunts. And you'll see that a little bit as we go through the actual hunting process. You also need to keep track of the endpoints. Now, I'm using the term endpoint loosely here. I'm not just referring to PCs and servers. It can be containers. It can be serverless functions. It can actually be a person. Basically, something that's actually leveraged to execute the attack, right? An attack has to come in and then it needs to be executed by something. So endpoints, and maybe the term used within Defender XDR is actually entities. So things like accounts or mailboxes or the underlying physical endpoints themselves or virtual endpoints themselves. Want to make sure that we're making note of these as we're going through the investigation. Identity is a key one because, of course, you get in, you can launch an attack, but really what's important is being able to track that attack against an identity. The reality is of our world today, you can't really do anything without an identity. So assuming somebody's identity is one of those key kind of components often to initiate an attack. And certainly in order to move laterally within the environment, being able to switch identities, obfuscate the attacker's true intentions by pivoting to multiple different identities is kind of a key thing that we want to make sure that we're looking out for. And we're tracking that again as we go in. With that may out very well, as I said earlier, be an input to a successive hunt where we see a compromised identity, for example, and now we need to kind of like double click down and do a further investigation on that particular identity. The fourth component is privilege. So in order to execute an attack and exfiltrate data or destroy data, at some point that identity has to have a certain level of privilege, whether that's access to sensitive data or high-level access to the system itself. So maintaining and tracking that privilege as we do our investigation or our hunt is going to serve to help us understand just how impactful a particular attack might be. And then last but not least, time. Now, time is a component that we afford attackers if we don't catch the attackers quickly enough. So it's often referred to as dwell time in the industry. The longer an attacker is within our environment, the more damage they can do, and the better that they can hide their tracks. So time is one of the things that you also want to keep track of in terms of how long an attacker is in our environment or how long an attack has been going on. And you'll actually see this when we go through some of the hunts where the time becomes a critical component, especially when linking successive hunts together, because sometimes if an attacker has obfuscated their identity, or maybe they've obfuscated the IP address they're coming from, or the system they're coming from, or even the country they're coming from, time is the only thing that you're actually going to be able to leverage to link those activities together. So time becomes a critical component when we're looking at hunting.
Hey, Dave, it's Mitch here. Do you mind if I interject for a moment?
Absolutely.
You mind just jumping back to the last slide there? Hi, everyone. This is Mitch Kelsey. I'm the national SOC leader here at CDW. So one thing I just wanted to mention quickly, that as we work through this threat hunt, is that we don't always start with one of these items in particular, because it's dependent on what clues we have available to us. So keep that in the back of your mind as we get into the campaign we're going to talk about ourselves, because we always have to be mindful of where we are in that life cycle and where we may need to go backwards and revisit things.
Thank you, Mitch. That's excellent context there. So very quickly, let's take a look at the anatomy of attack. Again, you'll have seen this before if you've attended any of our webinars, so I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. As an example, we're just going to pull out Sandworm here. It's a well-documented attack. And just to kind of show you how that flow process would work during the stages of an attack, you'll notice up in the left-hand corner there, we've got those attack components and we're tracking them as we go along. So in the first stage of this attack, as this attack unfolds, the things that we're going to be keeping track of are up in that right-hand corner, right? So we can see the attackers clearly coming in via an inbound internet connection. That's their vector, leveraging a vulnerability. They're attacking a web server in this particular case. So that's the endpoint. The identity that they're leveraging in this case is the web admin, and the privilege that they have on that box is user and root. Now I'm going to quickly click through how this attack unfolds. But as you can see up in the right-hand corner, we're now adding additional attack components, those items that we need to keep out of those entities as this attack unfolds, right? And so if you can think about it from a hunting perspective, we're often going to be using the various different components in those successive hunts. So for example, if we take a look at how we move from the third stage here, where we've got a domain user as the identity and a domain administrator, and we're looking at internal network as the vector, and specifically an internal workstation, when we can see as we pivot, right, now we've elevated that privilege to domain admin. Now we've switched that identity to domain administrator. Now we're directly targeting user workstations, right? So as we go through, whether that being investigating or hunting, these attack components, what we're calling them, these entities, are things that we need to track so we can further our investigation, and if necessary, leverage them as pivot points to do successive hunts.
Hey, David, do you mind if I
Absolutely, Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, Brian McCaffrey. I'm services manager here at CDW on our services side, working with threat intelligence, but my background is incident response and digital forensics. I just wanted to mention everything David is mentioning here. The four components, these pretty much make up what you'd know as the kill chain, like the Lockheed Martin kill chain. So whenever I started a threat hunt, I would start to get really familiar with the kill chains that were out there, just so I understood how the attack would probably go if it went by book, which it never does, but how the attack would flow so that I could sort of track my investigation along the kill chain. So kind of knowing how things work in advance like this, and you can just look up these kill chains in various places. But knowing how the attack flows will kind of guide your investigative steps and ultimately your report and the entire IR life cycle. So really good to go over the kill chains in advance. It'll just pop out at you when you're doing your threat hunt. And
yes,
thanks, Dave. Just wanted to mention that.
So let's very quickly talk about the threat hunting process. Now, this is, again, a simplified view of your threat hunting process where you start from the left-hand side and kind of move to the right-hand side. Now, the thing I do want to call out here is that the formulate hypothesis and the gather intelligence, those two phases, if you would, of the threat hunt are, quite frankly, interchangeable. You can see these as kind of triggers. So, for example, you might be just lying in bed one night and come up with an idea, or maybe you were talking to somebody about a particular threat actor that's out there and how they might operate. And so you're going to formulate that hypothesis first. And you start to ask yourself those questions of, like, who might those potential threat actors be? Where might I be vulnerable in my organization? What tactics and techniques might I use? But the inverse is also true, is that you may actually start with threat intelligence. So maybe you've got, maybe the trigger has been a threat report that you've received, and maybe it's actually from threat analytics, for example, threat report, or maybe some downstream threat intel organization that you leverage, and that's going to trigger you to start using that intelligence to start asking those questions and formulating that hypothesis in terms of how is somebody going to come against my environment, and again, really understanding what is the intent, or what is the attacker's motivation, what is their intent, what are the tactics that they use, whether or not they're a threat actor that's currently active, maybe against my particular industry. So really important, those two pieces. Once you've done that analysis on the intelligence, or you've got that hypothesis, you've collected what you need, now you can start really drilling down and start looking specifically at the chained activities that are going to be indicative of a true threat actor inside your environment. So, a single alert or a single event it's not indicative necessarily of malicious activity, or more specifically of an incident, right? You can have tons of brute force attempts against your organization, for example, but they're all blocked and there's no real downstream effect. So that's not really an indication of somebody in our environment doing some damage where we actually need to launch an investigation. So what it really is it's those chained activities. And the great thing about the threat intel, and you'll see this within threat analytics, we can get into it, is often those chained activities for a particular campaign or a particular threat actor are actually identified. So you can very quickly start to visualize and plan out what are those chain of activities, what are those techniques and procedures and tactics that occur in succession that are going to highlight that we actually have an issue here, that we have an incident we need to start investigating. Okay. From that point, once you've got that information, you understand that that chain of events that you're going to be looking for, now we want to start thinking about, well, how are we going to structure our hunt? Can we do it within, say, within the Defender/Sentinel console? Can we do that with a single query? Do we need to chain those queries? And getting into what we'll cover off next webinar, is there a way in which we can chain these hunts together in an automated fashion to lessen the amount of time that we're doing and really have a level of efficiency there? Then the next phase is really, now you're in the hunting space, right? Now you're performing the hunt. And the kinds of questions that you're answering through that hunt is, well, first you need to know where you're going to start, right? And again, that's going to get back to that research that you did kind of in advance in terms of that chain of activities. But the other questions you can ask yourself at that point is, well, what sources do I have available for me to assist with hunting? And you'll see there are some sources readily available actually within threat analytics. So some of those threat analytics reports that you may receive and you may read are going to actually have starting queries, if you were hunting queries, that you can pull from. You can also, if you happen to be leveraging Sentinel as well, there's a whole list of both hunting queries that often come from the content hub that you can pull down, or even analytic rules themselves that maybe you don't have enabled that you can leverage as a starting point to start those hunts. You can also use the community. There's large communities out there. You can even use ChatGPT as a starting point. In fact, quite often I'd say that's very common. Is like, how do I quickly look for X or Y within this particular environment? Of course, in this case, that would be Defender. You can also use third-party services, right? So sometimes the challenge is you know what you're looking for, but maybe you're not really experienced in KQL, for example, and you need some help actually writing that query. You can use other services that provide you with that kind of quick, rapid ability to map what you're looking for to an actual KQL query within the environment.
That's worth mentioning, David. Oftentimes when we're tasked with seeking out evidence of something in a hunt that's ad hoc, it's something that we started because we're gathering intelligence based on some other action that's happened, that if we're lucky, the information's already available in the source system we're using, like the Sentinel console, but sometimes it's third party. It could be coming from security research or from some other query language. And oftentimes we need the ability to be able to translate that for our own purposes. So it's helpful to know what to do in case that information comes from a third-party source, so that you know what best is going to be required for you to put it into the right console to use it for your purposes.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Mitch. Last but not least, what do we do if we actually find that we have activity that's indicative of being in a state of breach or being in a state of an incident, right? If we have that, and these are just some of the questions that we're going to be asking ourselves. If we have that evidence, well, what do we do next, right? How severe does that evidence suggest the incident is? Do we need to pull on our incident response retainer? Do we need to start doing massive containment and maybe isolating some devices or blocking out users, right? The real key question is how bad is it and how do we remediate this threat? And then, of course, something you should always do post-incident and something you should track while you're going through the hunting process and investigation process is those lessons learned. Like, how can we be more efficient at this in the future? How can we identify this? If you're doing this ad hoc, how can we formalize our threat hunting process so that it can be much more proactive, so that when we receive those threat intelligence reports, we're not just waiting until the last minute, we're actually structuring a threat hunting program. Okay, so let's take a look at how threat hunting can be done. And again, much more tactically for the purposes of this webinar. We're not going to go into the detailed kind of threat hunting process. This is a much more tactical approach, leveraging your existing tool sets today. Okay, now I'm going to quickly pivot into our environment here. And one thing I do want to call out before we continue going on is in the environment that you're seeing on the screen, this is the new blended environment where XDR, Defender XDR and Sentinel are together in one console. So you can see I've got all the Defender stuff, but I've got Sentinel here as well. Now, this is actually a relatively new feature. It was enabled and globally available, I should say. So it went GA about a month ago. the advantage that you get now is that as we do our hunts, and you're going to see this with some of the hunting queries that we do, is we're not just hunting within Defender, we're actually hunting across the entire landscape of the data that's within Defender and Sentinel collectively. So that's a key piece that I just wanted to call out before we get into this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about threat analytics. In my belief, it's probably one of the most underutilized and not talked about features of Defender, and arguably one of the best features you get with Defender, because it provides you a number of things. First and foremost, you're going to get notifications of new threat activity that's active out there in the wild. It may be a technique profile, it may be an actor profile, it may be an ongoing campaign, but you're going to be notified. You just have to set up your notifications. You can see the top right hand corner here where there's email notifications, so that you're getting these emails. And that can serve, especially if you're not in a formalized threat hunting program, that can serve as the trigger for your ad hoc threat hunting process. You get this new threat report that comes in, you review that threat report, and it's going to give you details around the threat and help you try to understand how you're going to hunt for it. So by way of example, I'm just going to quickly pull up what that email kind of looks like. It's pretty simple, to be perfectly honest. You get this email coming in. In this particular case, you can see it is an actor profile for Silk Typhoon. This was published on April 16th. All I have to do is go ahead and collect that wonderful view report link that's in there. And what it's going to bring us to is the actual analyst report, detailed information in this case about that threat actor. Right off of the get-go, and this you'll see this a little bit more clearly when we actually take a look at the actor profile that we're going to use for the actual threat hunting. But you can see that if I had any instance related to this particular threat actor, or if it was a technique profile, whatever the case may be, I would be able to view it here. Instead of 0 active instance, I would see that I actually have some that are currently active. I would see what their current action status. I would have a listing of all those assets, whether those are users or endpoints or mailboxes that are being affected by this particular attack, okay, or in this case, threat actor. But more importantly, I've got really good details on in this case, because it's a threat actor profile, on who this organization or this actor is going after, the tools and techniques to be on the lookout for, which is going to start to help to inform my threat hunting process, any type of exploits that they might be leveraging in this particular case, if they're dropping malware. Again, the specific attack tactics and techniques that are leveraged. And this is specific, in course, in this instance, to an attacker profile. You'll see where we have, we're actually going over an attack profile where this is a little bit more clear in terms of tangible things that you can hunt for. It's also going to give you some recommendation actions in terms of how you might want to prevent this particular type of attack or particular threat actor from getting access into your environment. It's going to tell you any endpoints that you have exposed via the vulnerabilities that are contained within the threat report, any impacted assets as we saw before, and you can click into any related instance. Now, again, we're going to go back into the main area of threat analytics, and you're going to see this a little bit more clearly where we have an actual threat actor profile that we're going to be leveraging, where there are some active incidents in this environment. So this is just kind of trying to paint that picture between going from that initial trigger of that threat report right into threat analytics to start thinking about how you're going to hunt for this activity. Now, if I switch back to threat analytics for a second, before we actually get into some of the threat hunting profiles that we're going to leverage today, I just want to point out that when you come into threat analytics, one of the really handy things is you're kind of hunting for activity without actually doing anything. So as you can see over on the right-hand side there, under high impact threats, you can see that there's a technique profile that's there, specifically password spray attacks. You can see that there's a threat overview report, specifically around cloud identity abuse. You can see a threat overview for exfiltration, and you can see a technique profile for brute force. So these are reports that are available to you within threat analytics. But what's key here is it's already identifying either attacks that have been remediated, so resolved, or active incidents, active alerts within my environment associated with these types of attacks or these types of profiles. And again, if it was a threat actor profile, you would see that here as well. What makes this really handy is you can very quickly pivot to something like the attack profile for password spray attacks. I'll just do that quickly now just so you can see what that looks like. And I can start to immediately think about, well, how am I actually going to take a look for this activity within my environment? I already know that I've got related incidents associated with this particular attack profile. Sorry, let me just change that because we did this activity a while ago. I've already got live or active instances in my environment that are associated with this particular activity. So it's really helpful, you know, the minute you go into the threat analytics to be able to very quickly see whether or not you have any active threats in your environment for which you really need to come up to speed and understand how this attack is unfolding. And again, a lot of this information, you're going to see this a little bit later on as well. A lot of this information you can leverage to start your hunting. And I'm going to leave this up because we're going to pivot back to it when you see the profile that we're going to go after in terms of the attack profile that we're going to leverage for the actual hunting today. The other thing, just
yep,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I was just going to say that last page is really good. We were always, you know, hammered on training. It was hammered into us, like, keep in mind your report, right? At the end of this, like, you've got a job to do to do your hunt and find the evidence, your observations that'll go with your hypotheses. But this type of thing right here is invaluable for your final report, because you could grab this and throw it in your final report and edit it to make it yours. But this is the kind of thing we were always missing in the field, right? Like, reports were always weak in the incident response or threat hunting kind of world. It's just a known thing. This helps immensely because you can grab whatever you want from here, and then you notice some other tabs across the top. We'll probably go over those, but there's a lot that's just integrated here. These pivots that David is talking about, in real life, those would take days to do. And it wasn't like a technical thing usually. It was because you had to, like, go find the person that's responsible for this component and then get the logs or get whatever data. And it just turned into this whole thing. Here, it's literally all integrated and gives you the entire attack surface view. So from a threat hunter perspective, I've just saved days worth of work, just based on what David's shown so far. And
thanks, Brian. Really good context there. Going back to the threat analytics, the other thing before we actually go into the profile that we're going to leverage today is it's not, when you look at threat analytics, we're not just talking about techniques, we're not just talking about tactics, but we're also talking about high exposure vulnerabilities, right? So there's one here that you can see that's down below. It's the XY utility vulnerability. Now in this instance, we don't have any instances of this in our environment, but we do have some other ones that are clearly visible on the screen here, right? So let's take a look at the tool profile. Lasagna, or that's how I like to call it, or lasagna, I should say, lasagna. And you can see we actually have 27 incidents of that vulnerability being exposed within our environment. So again, I've done nothing here other than look at this page, and I know I have problems that are associated either with attack campaigns or threat actor profiles, or with high level, high impact vulnerabilities, and I need to start hunting for those. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is now we're going to choose a specific pivot here. We're going to go into a report, specifically something, an attack campaign, if you would, specifically for Peach Sandstorm. Okay, so Peach Sandstorm is a threat actor. There are threat actor profiles that you can read up. They've launched multiple different types of attacks. So we've chosen one of their attacks in this case to kind of highlight how you can leverage this threat intel. Again, built in, comes with your Defender licensing already, to start to inform how you might hunt for this particular type of activity. Not enough time to go into this report in detail. I will tell you it is actually summarized quite well. It gives you details in terms of how the attack would unfold. We're going to talk about this in just a second. It's going to talk about some of the initial mechanisms of how the attacker gets into the environment under this attack. It's going to tell you the various stages, some of the mechanisms, what to look for in terms of post-compromise. And it's also going to give you some of the things to look for, not necessarily from a hunting perspective, but certainly from a detection perspective, things you'll look for within Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Identity, Defender for Cloud Apps, as well as give you all those kind of recommendations. And again, if we had activity associated with this particular incident, that have been flagged. Now we say activity that's been flagged. This is things that the platform has identified for us. Now you won't see that because we've deliberately set up the environment so it wouldn't detect this activity so that we could just hunt for it. But if there was anything that was identified and we didn't turn off some of the detection features to catch this stuff, you would see those related instances here, just like we saw kind of previously. Same in terms of things like the any impacted assets or exposure points, all that stuff is still valid. Okay. And actually, when we get into the password spray component of this, because we are going to pivot to some research specifically on that, I said it would come back, and we will take a look at that when we come back. You're going to see where we actually do have some of those related incidents. Okay, so let's focus on what Brian referred to as that kill chain, or what I like to call the chain of events, right? So within this particular attack profile, you can see that what Peach Sandstorm, what that threat actor group does is they leverage one of two paths, right? Path one is they're going to do some sort of initial access. They're suggesting password spray, then move on to do some reconnaissance with Azure Hound to fingerprint or to map out your Azure environment and leverage that to then pivot in to a target and either move laterally, either load in some DLLs, or establish an outbound C2 tunnel. There's also a second path you can see that they've leveraged, either Confluence or Manage Engine in this particular case, where they're, instead of doing that initial access piece, they're actually coming in through that vulnerability and targeting that environment directly to establish persistence, and then obviously be able to communicate outbound to those C2 channels and do their nasties. What we're going to do today is we're going to focus on this first attack path. Okay, so again, leveraging that research, even just this diagram, and it's not always going to look like this in the threat reports, but all the threat reports will identify, particularly if it's a specific type of attack, they're going to identify those chain of activities. So we can leverage that identified chain of activities so that we know that sequence of events right at the get-go, and that starts to inform that structure of the hunt that we talked about when we were speaking about the threat hunting process. Now I don't need to necessarily do all that legwork. I just simply need to understand the chain of activities that I want to look for. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to take this profile and we're going to pivot and say, okay, the first thing that we need to do is we need to identify that initial access. So we need to see if we've had a password spray attack, and as a result of that, have there been any successful login? So if any of our users had their account compromised via that kind of password spray mechanism. And if we see that, we need to move to that next stage, saying, okay, we've seen that we've actually got this successful access into our environment. Has it been leveraged to now do this reconnaissance that we talk about? Specifically, we're going to be looking for Azure Hound activity. And if we see that Azure Hound activity, do we then see lateral movement from the cloud into our environment? So by leveraging just what we see on the screen here, we already have a structure for how we want to approach this hunt. Now, one of the advantages that you happen to get with the threat analytics is it's not just threat actor reports, and it's not just attack campaign reports. It's also providing information on how certain techniques like password spray, for example, can be leveraged, and information on how we can look for that. So I'm just going to pivot back to what we had brought up before, which was the password spray attack. So I'm just going to close this one down just to make it easier. So this is a specific technique profile. Again, it's a threat report available to you in Threat Analytics that provides you information on password spray attacks. All of this is really good information that you can absolutely read through and start to understand what to look for. But one of the really cool components that you get is it gives you starting points for hunts. right? The queries, the KQL queries that you may want to execute against your environment to look for this activity. And it's a number of different threat hunts or threat queries that you can take a look at. So there's one here for failed login activity. There's one here for suspicious MFA reset operations. You even got one for MFA fatigue. Okay, so these are the types of things. It gives you a good starting point. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to run these queries and if it returns back nothing, that you're good to go. That's not the intent here, but it is a good starting point, especially if you're not familiar with KQL queries and the structure of KQL, or maybe you don't understand the schema of the Defender and Sentinel databases. It's a really good starting point to start that hunt. Now, in our case, we're a little bit more advanced. Of course, we run our own managed services. We have a SOC. So while we may still leverage these starting points, we have crafted specifically for today a series of queries to identify this activity within our environment. Okay. I'm just going to quickly switch this because I want to see if that is actually going to pop up. You should see some related instance. So I said that with these technique profiles, and you saw this obviously in threat analytics, but within these analyst reports, if there are active incidents that have already been identified previously, in this case, this is historical stuff that we are seeing here, because again, we turned off this detection capability in order to successfully simulate this attack. But back in the past, we still have open instance where this has been identified. So you'll be able to see that with these technique profiles, right? And again, you'll be able to see any impacted assets. I'll just wait for it to load. Any exposure events, if it happens to relate to any endpoints or users. The idea here is that, again, we haven't even written a query and we can already see that we have a problem here. And a lot of that investigative mechanisms or investigative processes, those hunts that we would need to do, have kind of already been done for us. We've identified a device, we've identified some users, maybe some cloud resources that are impacted.
And I love this impacted assets piece because the bane of my existence in or anyone's existence doing threat hunting or incident response was always first trying to get an asset inventory for what the environment looked like if you didn't have that. I really loved because when I used to do threat hunting, it was with different tools. So even approaching it with this set of tools, having this inventory automatically integrated and correlated across the attack surface, that's another huge time savings that was never fun to do as part of the threat hunting workflow. So it's great to see that right here. And the pivoting happens much quicker when you've got your inventory and, ratings of assets being impacted, right? Kind of tells you what to go. You can now go hunt against those assets. So another kind of time saver there. That's a huge piece right there to me. That really sticks out, the asset piece. Just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, also, early on, helps to provide indication of criticality of what might be happening here. This might be the point where you have to start raising this with other stakeholders because you know that these impacted devices are really important. And again, having that at your fingertips as you're starting your hunt is really valuable to level set there.
Good context. Thank you, Mitch. Okay, so let's start this hunting process. Now, I had mentioned earlier where some of the sources of hunting queries can come from to start your process, and I had suggested that you actually have access, if you're running Sentinel, through the Content Hub to some highly qualified threat hunting queries that have already been written, or even some analytical rules that you can simply modify for your purposes. And that's precisely what we've used for this starting hunt. So this is actually an analytic rule that comes with Sentinel out of the Content Hub that's specifically looking for password spray style attacks. Now we've modified it in this case for our purposes. So that it can be leveraged. But the idea of what this is looking for, it's not just looking for attempts at password sprays. What we're trying to identify is, do we see a history of password spray attacks against us followed in short succession by a successful login, right? Because that is indicative of a successful password attack, or at least a validation that an account has been compromised. So when we run this query, which I have already run in the interest of time so that you can see the data up on the screen, what we can see here is that we actually do have an indication of some successful password spray activity. You can see the accounts here that were leveraged in this attack. Now, this was a small, obviously, attack that we've launched to simulate the activity. Often this will be a considerably larger user list or a much higher failure count than what we've leveraged here. You can see the number of failures by each one of those user principal names that you've understood, the users effectively. But most importantly, after the global failures that you see here, you can see the successful account here. So this is something, again, that's been written by Microsoft to detect these types of attacks. But what we're seeing here is we have confirmed that we have a number of failures coming from a single IP address, followed by at least one successful login, or at least one successful validation of credentials. We do need to do a little bit more hunting to identify whether or not it's been a successful login. Now, if you go back to what we referred to before about those attack components and those things that you want to keep in account of here, well, we know the user principal names that now we need to be taking a look at to see, well, which one of these was actually compromised. We have that time, so we know the start and finish time of when this attack kind of took place. And we know the IP address of the attacker. Now, realistically, when attacks unfold, and if they're very advanced attacks, some of these things may change over time. So, for example, your IP address, that's often going to be obfuscated or rotated, so you may not actually be able to track just against IP. And you'll see an example of this later on in the second phase of this webinar, where we have to actually pivot to take a look at what assets were compromised, and the IP address is in fact different, and the only thing we have to go by there is time. But generally speaking, you can start to at least collect this information so you can use it as inputs to successive hunts, which is precisely what we're going to do next. So we've identified we actually have a problem here. We have at least one account that has been compromised where the credentials themselves have been validated through that kind of initial login. And again, just so you guys are aware, if you've got your users set up for MFA, that MFA is only going to happen once there has been a successful login attempt. It's just the process by which it works. So once the credentials have been validated, that's when the MFA kind of pops up. So we don't know yet whether or not this particular user or this particular account has been compromised to the point where it's been used to log in. We simply know that the credentials have been validated. So we're going to move to that next stage of the hunt, where we are going to take this IP address and we're going to plunk it in and see, okay, well, do we have any successful sign-in events against this particular IP address, and specifically, or leverage from this IP address, and specifically against what user principal name, so what users. So when we run this hunt, you can see I've set that the time range here, because one of those things that we had from the other query in the results was that time range. In this case, I'm now going to look at an entire day. You're probably normally going to look longer than that, but in the interest of time and speed, we're just going to set it to a day here. Now, we've run this query specifically looking at both interactive and non-interactive sign-ins. So that's those two tables that you see up top there, sign-in logs or your interactive logs. AAD non-interactive sign-in logs are your non-interactive, so you're not back and forth. So we're trying to track both of these, specifically against that IP address. And we're looking now for successful logins, so result type 0. What you can see back on the screen here is we've got a lot of successful activity. So now we're at the point where, okay, this is an incident, right? We have confirmed somebody is in our environment somewhere. They may be on a box somewhere. They may be accessing our environment via PowerShell. They may simply be trying to sign into Active Directory, but we know explicitly that we have a problem here. Now, what we can see on the screen here is what we've revealed back is actually there's quite a bit of activity that's gone against our environment with this particular compromised user. In this case, it's Bob at cdwtestlab.ca. Somebody has successfully signed in. They've leveraged PowerShell. They've gone against Active Directory. We can also see that there's a Windows sign in there. We'll pivot back to that in a second. So I'm going to now go back to the threat analytics report that we were reviewing previously, right? So we've effectively, in this chain of activities, confirmed that yes, a password spray attack has been launched, and the password spray attack has successfully compromised a user account because we saw that successful login. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's Peach Sandstorm that's in our environment, but it does mean we need to continue looking at these chain of events, okay? What comes next in the chain of events for this particular actor profile is recon activity, specifically leveraging Azure Hound. Okay, and Azure Hound is it's a recon tool that can be leveraged by attackers and, quite frankly, by IT admins as well, to help kind of fingerprint and profile, or to use, Mitch, I'm going to steal your term there, enumerate your Azure environment. Okay.
Absolutely. And just to take a quick step back, if you don't mind, David, while MFA is necessary in this case for that threat actor to get into the environment, their knowledge by itself of that breached password is something that they likely are going to want to leverage using Azure Hound to see where else they might throw that password around the network when they get to this point. So the fact that that was leaked in and of itself is something that we like to be aware of in the SOC for monitoring. And it does come back into play as we get later into this campaign in terms of where that might also be impacted in case there's shared passwords or any of those other not best practice circumstances happening in a network.
That's a really good point, Mitch. And what you'll see next in the next webinar is, we're going to get some profiles on this user, and we're going to find that this particular user is not enabled for MFA. But just because a user is enabled for MFA doesn't mean that that credential is still protected, because, of course, MFA is not necessarily phish proof, right? So yes, you can use phish resistant MFA techniques, for example, requiring a user to enter in a number that appears on your authenticator app, but it's not foolproof. So MFA is a control that's going to help to prevent breaches, but it's not a guarantee, right? It's not foolproof. And so as a result, when we see that there is successful activity, even if it's just validating credentials, we know it's something that we need to keep an eye on. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the inputs now, specifically from that previous hunt where we identified we have the IP address already and we have the time. Now we know specifically the account that we believe is compromised because we've seen that sign-in activity. So we are going to pivot again to another KQL query, so another hunt where we're going to look specifically for Azure Hound activity. It's actually a relatively simple query that we're going to look for here, specifically looking for Azure Hound. You can see, actually, sorry, I've got the wrong one. Oh, no, it's the right one on the screen here. In this particular instance, the sign-in logs, when you sign into Azure AD, it's collecting a user agent. Now, you might not always be able to look just for the user agent Azure Hound. A lot of times you will, but if it's been obfuscated, you actually may need now to chain the activities that Azure Hound leverages. So the process that it goes through in terms of the sequence of events, it starts to profile, if you would, your Azure environment. You might need to write hunts specifically for that. In the interest of time, however, because we only have 13 minutes left, this query is specifically designed just to look for that user agent, again, against that particular IP address. And we could shrink this down even further if we wanted to and leverage in the where clause the user principal name, because of course we do already know that that user has been compromised. That being said, looking specifically just for Azure Hound activity, even without the IP address and even without the compromised account, may help to uncover other accounts that have been compromised and may have been compromised earlier, and other activity from other sign-ins that we may want to link to this particular incident, even though it didn't occur within the time window that we're looking at, or by that same IP address or by that same user. Now, what you can see here is from this query, what it has returned is yes, there has been successful activity leveraging Azure Hound, doing if you will, the fingerprinting, the profiling of our environment, specifically leveraging that compromised credential. Okay, so now if we go back to that threat analytics report that we were referencing earlier, we've confirmed that the first two stages of this particular research report on an attack pattern or attack profile, we've confirmed that has happened against our environment. We've had a successful password spray attack where an account has been compromised. We've seen an actual login to our assets, whether that be Azure AD or, and again, you'll see this a little bit later on, Windows sign-in. And we've also seen where that account compromised, that compromised account, I should say, has been leveraged to do recon activity. Now, one of the things that we should do, there's just not time for this, but we should do is we should be taking a look at that user account right now and saying, okay, well, how are they set up? What access do they have? I will simply tell you, because I know, and we'll probably show this in the next webinar, that Bob is actually a global admin, which means he's got a lot of access, and we already know from what I said previously that we specifically disabled MFA so that we could launch this attack. So that's how this attacker was able to get in. And that's really good information, especially when when we get into that kind of next stage on lateral movement, because if you're a global admin and or a domain admin, you can do a lot more damage. We won't get time to see that kind of all the way through to fruition today. That will occur certainly in the next webinar. But we will start to pivot still a little bit more. We'll run at least one more, maybe two more hunts here, just to sort of paint this picture on how we can start now building out and figuring out where this particular threat actor has gone with this compromised credential. Now, it's at this point I'm going to point out that the environment that you're looking at here and that we've set up is what we call a hybrid environment. So there is an on-premise Active Directory domain that is connected up into Azure AD in this hybrid kind of environment. So all authentications, while they come against Azure Active Directory initially, for the assets that are internal to our environment, those are actually going against Active Directory. And what we've been looking at so far, particularly on the password sprays, we've been looking at those cloud-based attacks. So against Azure AD, okay, or against Graph, because you can take a look at the Graph logs as well. But in particular, what we haven't been looking at is any of that authentication activity inside our environment. Now that can get quite tricky to do that kind of hunt. Typically, what you would need to do in this environment, and you can see you can leverage Sentinel here, is you do need to be bringing up your security events from your domain controllers, those login events, bring them into the security event table, and writing a fairly complex query to try to bring this stuff together. Usually based off time, you do need to do a bit of translation around UPN versus how they appear in Azure Active Directory versus Active Directory. So there's a lot of, it can be quite complicated to do. Totally doable, totally available to you. There's lots of actual queries that exist, again, in the community where you can do that sort of thing. However, if you're leveraging Defender XDR, it means you have access to Defender for Identity. And if you've deployed the Defender for Identity client to your domain controllers, it is automatically collecting those sign-in activities, all of that activity that we care about from Active Directory, and it's already cross-correlating it in a table with Azure AD and any type of cloud level authentication events. Now, the name of that table is the identity identity login events table. So that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to take that same IP address, okay, which we got from the very first query, the same time that we got from the first and second query, and that account that we know is now compromised, which we got from the third query, and we're going to pump it in here. And now we're going to run this query against the identity login events table to see where this particular compromised account has been leveraged. Now, very quickly, we can see on the screen, again, on the interest of time, because we are running near to the end of this webinar, I'm just going to go over this relatively quickly. What we can see is we have a number of login successes, okay? In terms of, and I've projected this table just to make it, that's removing the columns from the query here, just to make it easier for us to digest. The one thing I want to point out here, though, is the very last login that we're seeing there is actually against a Windows desktop. So what we have now confirmed simply by looking at running a query against login identity events is we've seen that there was the cloud login and that was successful, but we are actually now seeing the pivot. Okay, we are seeing that this attacker has actually pivoted from the cloud to a physical asset within our environment, specifically a desktop. So again, if we go back to the cloud, to the threat analytics report that we've been leveraging, we have moved from the initial access where we first took a look at whether a password spray was even launched against our organization. We've confirmed an account was successfully compromised. That same account was leveraged to profile our Azure Active Directory environment and get all the information in terms of the types of users and their permission levels. And again, as I highlighted, and didn't show this, but as I highlighted, Bob is a global admin, not set up for MFA. And then we've just confirmed with this last query that this credential was able to be leveraged to pivot to a physical asset. So we are all the way now inside. Go ahead, Mitch.
If you don't mind, Dave, I just want to underscore the fact that having seen a lot of the work that our red teamers or offensive security practice has done over the years, this is a common and dangerous way that organizations are fully compromised as part of hopefully pen tests, if not actual attack campaigns. In part, this is because for organizations that haven't done hardening of their Active Directory environments, they're there's a lot of available out-of-box tools for threat actors to use. And if you don't have this visibility, a lot of your traditional tooling is not going to identify this type of identity-based attack without what you've just covered in this time. So I'm really glad you're covering this, because this is often a really dangerous attack path for threat actors once they get to the stage.
Thank you, Mitch. Brian, is there any color you want to add as well? Nope. Okay, good.
No,
oh, you did. Sorry, on mute.
I was too slow on the mute button. Yeah, no, it's just this end-to-end. Just thinking about it, I know we haven't gotten to part 2 yet, but again, the whole keeping in mind, what we're trying to do, the objective for the threat hunt, as we come across observations. One of the tips I picked up along the way, this isn't anything technical, but as you're coming across your observations, just keep track of those on the side, because they're going to go into your report. And then when at the end, when you've got your investigative time flow, and we'll cover this just again as a reminder in part 2, but everything we're showing here on the architecture and then the attack flow. So the Dave's preferred terminology was order of events, I think, or chain of event. I'm still using the old kill chain. Can't get it out of me. But that kill chain will sort of go across, and then your investigative, I call it the investigative timeline, but it's your threat hunting timeline, will kind of map to it. So if you've got your order of events for the attack, and then you've got your investigative workflow, your threat hunt workflow below it, it's a nice kind of thing to include in a report to show, yeah, I'm aware of the sequence of the attack, and I looked in the places, the usual suspect places and maybe some other places. But it's nice to show what you found and map that back to how an attack normally flows. It just gels it all together. And it's great for a debrief after as well. Anyway, just wanted to put that in there.
So guys, we have 3 minutes left. I do want to whet your appetite for what's going to come in part 2. So there is one more query that I want to show you. We're not going to go into details with it. It's because it's going to be a series of 4 or 5 more queries that we're going to need to do here. And you'll see that in part 2 and the automation. But what we've identified so far is that somebody's gotten into our environment and gotten onto an asset, but we don't know which one yet. So now we need to figure out what asset has been compromised. So I'm just going to very quickly show you the last threat hunting query that we're going to demo today. And we'll go into this a little bit deeper, because what you'll find once we've identified a device, our threat hunting may not continue in this form. You may still be able to run queries, but you may actually now have to pivot down to the device and start taking a look at the detailed EDR logs and tagging stuff. And you will see that again a little bit next in the next webinar. But very quickly, I do want to show what we have done here is we have limited the amount of time that we're, so the time window. So you'd heard me say earlier that it's going to be quite common that attackers are not going to have their attacks all coming from the same location. So this is from the same IP, or leveraging the same user account, or even leveraging the same attacks and techniques and whatnot. So once we get to the point we're at right now today, we're going to see that there's a bit of a change here, that the IP address that's being leveraged to actually do that login and start to continue that attack is not the same as what we looked like before. And as I mentioned before, sometimes the only connection you have between 2 events is time. And that's precisely what we've done here. If you take a look at what has come back in the sequence of events from the last query we ran, we can see that that last login was at 12:51:46 for the Bob at CDW test lab account, so for that compromised account. So what we've done is we've shrunken the time window to a 4-minute window where we want to actually see the device login events. Okay, so specifically these events that are indicative, saying, okay, we actually have somebody logging in within a reasonable amount of time, a very short window from when we saw that sign in happen within Active Directory. And clearly what has been shown here on the table, and we will go into this a little bit later on in phase 2 on how now we're going to see when we started to explore what's come back here, that the IP address actually is different. And now that's another indicator that we need to go look and we need to go hunt for. We're also going to see how we're going to need to now pivot onto that device itself and go through its EDR, the full recording of activities. So start to look for some of the activities that were done within this time window by the attacker to potentially, and again, coming back to the threat analytics report, because we know that next stage is either doing one of these next kind of attacks, whether it's leveraging a DLL sideload, or more specifically, what we're going to look for is that outbound C2 traffic. So that's going to come next webinar, guys. We are officially out of time. One thing I will say very quickly here, we have our second part of this webinar. It's currently scheduled for May the 2nd. If you register soon, it will stay that way. If you don't, it will change because we need to make sure that we actually have a good set of folks that are joining our webinars here. So we may delay it a couple of weeks there. If you haven't already registered for that webinar, you can do that now. There's a QR code that you can see that's on the screen. You can go ahead and you can scan that and register for that. And again, the second part of that webinar, we're going to go deeper into this hunt initially. So the first half, that's what we're going to cover off, is how to actually get right down to the endpoint. And then we're going to take a step back and start to talk about, well, what are the options available to you to automate this hunting process? Specifically, the really easy way within Defender and Sentinel, and the more, I would say, complex, but maybe better for you way. So that's set to come during our next webinar series. Folks, if you have any questions or whatnot, please reach out to your account representative from CDW. They will forward them on to us and we will do our best to answer. Also, so that everybody is aware, we do post these webinars on our YouTube channel. This one will be going up probably by Tuesday of next week. You'll get a link to that. And, if you have colleagues that are interested and want to watch and couldn't attend this webinar, you're more than welcome to send them there. We have a whole bunch of other webinars on Defender and Sentinel as well that are up there that may be very useful to you. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. I do appreciate it. I look forward to having you all in our next second part of this series where we continue to look at our hunts and do the automation pieces. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day.